Hey guys, it's Michael. Welcome back to my YouTube channel and welcome to a new video. Today we are going to cover a full tutorial on the weighted dips, showing you the equipment that you need to have, the setups that you need to build, and of course the common mistakes that you can do and how to execute it properly. The full tutorial is taken from my new program, Professional Street Lifting Program. So if you're interested in more in-depth tutorials for muscle ups, pull-ups, squats, bench press, and all the other lifts that are related to street lifting, let it be the competition lifts and its accessory lifts, then make sure to check out the new program. It's currently on Black Week sale, so definitely get it now for a huge discount, and now enjoy the most comprehensive dip tutorial you have ever seen. Let's take a look at the equipment that we need or that we can need for the dips. First of all, we need dip bars. When you take a look at dip bars, you want to have them at a height that is at least chest to shoulder level. Why? Because only then you can really dip full range of motion without touching the floor. So make sure that when you have dip bars available, that they are high enough. When it comes to the width of your grip, then it kind of depends on your personal preference. A good rule of thumb is that you have at least elbow to fingers width, and then take a look at how further you want to extend it. The wider you grip, usually it becomes a bit more chest dominant, and if you go a bit more narrow, it usually becomes a bit more shoulders dominant, but that's only a rule of thumb and you really need to figure out your own setup here. So really optimal is it if you have adjustable dip bars that you can really adjust in their width. For me, what I use personally is this width, which is elbow to fingers with 3 additional fingers. For me, this is a wider, wide grip, so a bit more of a chest dominant technique that I use here. Let's take a look at the essential equipment that we need for proper weighted calisthenics competition dip. The first thing we want to take a look at is the box. The box is really an essential piece of equipment because the box will allow you to have a proper entrance into the dip. If I don't have a box, I need to jump into my dip and perform half a repetition before I even start the dip. That is a problem because if I have a lot of weight, that costs me a lot of energy. So what I need is a box that allows me to enter with properly straightened arms and depressed shoulders. So the box needs to be high enough that I can enter the dip comfortably. If the box is too low, you will have the same problem that you need to perform a quarter or half a dip. When it comes to the position of the box, I want to give you a good rule of thumb, and that is you stand with your back on the bars, and then roughly 1 foot length away is a good position for the bar, because then you can enter comfortably, you don't swing too much, but it's also not too close that you will bump your plates against the box. The next essential piece of equipment for a weighted dip is a weighted belt. So in our case, we of course take the King of Weighted belt. And when we're dipping, we want to make sure that the belt sits properly on our hips. So if here is your hip bone, the belt should sit on the hips and here above your glutes. So it's not sitting on your lower back like that and pulls you into that hollow back position. It really sits on the hip and on top of your glutes. Then you want to make sure that the belt is closed at the front like this, and then you want to make sure that it is centered. So if you take a look at the front view, you want to have the belt sitting in the middle of your pelvis, not shifted to the left and not shifted to the right. It should be centered. So a proper belt needs 3 carabiners. We have 1 to close the belt, as I just showed you, and 1 at each end of your chain, or in our case on the daisy chain. Why do we need 3? Because 1 here, 1 to close it, and then 1 to close the belt properly. Now, with the belt, we go with the rope through the whole of the plate, and then we mount it on the other side of our belt. If the chain is too long and the weight would hang too low, what you can easily do is, if you are using the King of Weighted belt, which I definitely suggest, is you just use a different hole of the belt. Then you put the carabiner through, and then you put it back in the belt. And now I've shortened the belt by roughly 30 centimeters in length. To give you some insights on a proper position of the plates is that if you stand freely or if you then hang freely, that the weight should hang roughly at the height of your feet, because then you can control the weight with your feet and you can actually get some grip on the plates. So when you're setting up your belt, make sure that the weight hangs low enough. And if you have very, very big bumper plates, make sure that the chain is long enough to really go through everything and still provide a suitable height of the plates. Another essential piece is liquid chalk. Whenever we're talking about strength sports where our hand connects us to the equipment, we want to make sure that this grip is tight, provides a lot of friction and so stability. And how can we improve the grip and the friction and the stability? If we use liquid chalk. So when it comes to dips, pull-ups, muscle-ups, all those different kind of movements and elements, make sure to chalk up. Chalk up the hands and chalk up the equipment. So you want to have roughly, what is that, pea size of chalk. You rub it a bit, then you can put a bit on the bars. You will still have enough on your hands. Make sure it dries sufficiently, and then you will have proper grip with your hand on the bar. Let's also cover some additional or optional equipment that you can use to increase the performance of your dip. The first thing would be wrist wraps. What the wrist wraps are doing is you will wrap them around the wrist like that, so that they cover the lower part of your thumb. And what they will do is they will limit the motion of your wrist. And so they will create stability and they will create awareness of that joint. And this can lead to a feeling of safety and so stability and so more performance. So wrist wraps can definitely help you to improve your dip performance. Second piece of optional equipment will be elbow sleeves. These are for me now size S, SBD, but there are also tons of other brands providing you with good elbow sleeves. So to put them on, you just wrap them up, pull them over your elbow, and then flip them around. And what they do is they will of course warm up the joint, because now it feels pretty warm. They will provide a passive force the moment I flex the elbow, so they will create tension here. And also they will give me, similar to a belt when you squat, they will give me some kind of passive resistance here, because this fabric material fills up the joint the moment I dip. So it gives me psychological advantage because I can feel the joint better, it feels warm, so my technique will improve, and at the same time it will also give me some extra force to then extend my elbow. So it's a win-win situation, but that's also why elbow sleeves are sometimes forbidden in competition, sometimes they are allowed, because they will provide you with a real strength advantage. Let's take a look at the proper grip on the dip bars. What we want is a grip where our wrist is centered on the bars and where the force transmission into the bar is achieved in this area of the hand, so the ulnar side of your wrist here. And how can we achieve that? First of all, it would be good if the dip bar has a sufficient diameter. So too narrow bars are not a good idea. Competition standard is 50 millimeter in diameter. What I want you to try then is place your wrist on the bar with your thumb pointing towards the midline of the bars. what that does is it will put the underside of your wrist also in the center of the bar, like that. You do that on both hands, then thumb in, and if you then grip, you will feel that you have the pressure exactly where you want it, and the wrists are centered above the bar. Because what we want to avoid is the wrist collapsing inward, and at the same time we also want to avoid that the wrist is too far outside that you can slip like that. So wrist properly centered on the bar. Now let's take a closer look at the proper execution of a competition dip. To understand why we are executing it in the way we are going to do it, we need some basic shoulder anatomy knowledge. So when we're looking at the shoulder joint, the range, we can move it into extension without moving the scapulars is very, very limited. And if we're loading up our shoulder, we want to limit the movement because we don't want to work in those unstable end ranges with those elevated scapulars, because this is very, very hard to stabilize if we're really working with a lot of additional load. If you're working with lighter loads and body weight, there is no problem with going full range of motion, but if we're loading it up very heavy, we want to restrict the ranges and really just work with the range that our shoulder provides. And if you test that on your own and fix your scapulars, that's about it. There is not too much range of motion left. So if we now have this range, you see that this is not sufficient to achieve a sufficient depth for a competition dip, which is, depending on the competition, but mostly it's rear delt below the elbow. So to achieve that additional depth of the dip, I need to lean in until I hit sufficient depth. And that is why we are crunching in to achieve sufficient depth without losing the stability in our scapula. So when you're entering the setup, we are now in the starting position of the dip. We want to make sure that the shoulder is depressed. So we're moving it away from the ear. Or you can also think of pressing yourself away from the bars. In that position, what I want you to do is slightly rotate your hips posterior, like that. So in the end, what we want to achieve is just that we want to flatten the lower back. So we don't want to have that arched position here, that anterior tilt, we want to have it posterior. You don't need any crazy amount of core tension, you don't need crazy amount of glute tension, just rotate it to flatten out that lower back. So shoulder is depressed, lower back is flat. The next thing you want to do is you want to breathe into your chest and you want to expand your rib cage. Why do we want to do that? Because it puts our chest in a better position to accept force when we are initiating the movement. And that is going to be the starting position that we're going to take and where the further explanation happens. Okay, small recap on the entrance and starting position. Proper setup on the wrists, centered, then control the weight, arms are straight, shoulders depressed, hip posterior tilted. Now, we want to look roughly 2 to 3 meters in front on the floor. So you don't want to watch to the ceiling and you don't want to watch straight to the floor. So to remain roughly a neutral spine, you want to have the vision slightly in front of you. What you can do later if you play around with different techniques is to support the movement with your cervical spine. That means when you're going down, you also guide the vision down, and if you're dipping up, you also guide the vision up. That is something you can play around later, but if you start to dip, try to have your cervical spine roughly neutral, and that works best if you just take a look at the floor in front of you. So back to the starting position. And now what we want is the same time we're bending the elbows, we're moving the shoulders forward and down. Like that. So you don't just bend the elbows, or you don't just lean forward. You want to have elbow bending and the shoulders moving forward and down at the same time. Like that. Why is that important? Because that will lead to a very, very vertical hip path and so also to a vertical path of the additional weight. This avoids swinging and makes your dip much more stable. When we are doing that competition style of dip technique, you can also get a bit more secure in technique by just looking at the direction of your sternum. And what the sternum will do is, in the starting position, it points forward. The chest is kind of proud. Then it descends and orientates itself more to the floor. And on the way up, you push the sternum back into that starting position, because that will help you to guide the movement of your rib cage additionally to the hips and the shoulders and the elbows. Especially when you're learning the dip technique and when you're playing around with this compression to expansion style of dips, what you will see probably also in your technique is that you overdo one or the other movement. So if we overdo it on the compression, you can see that the hips are barely moving anymore. And this will lead in competition to insufficient hip depth and you will get a no rep. So make sure that your hips are moving down. So don't overdo it on the crunch. The same happens if you expand too much. That will lead to a dip. So we're now getting a bit more into that expanded position like that. That you see that my hips are traveling way too deep and the range of motion in my shoulder comes also a lot from the scapula, creating a bottom position that is very, very hard to stabilize under a lot of load. So you want to find the middle way between those two where you can perform strong and where you achieve sufficient depth. So somewhere in between your individual style of dip will happen.